Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, and in today's video we've got some class tuning hotfixes coming on December 13th, 14th in EU. We've been taking a long look at tank survivability as we prepare for the beginning of Dragonflight Season 1. In general, we found that the new talent trees have introduced a lot of power, and talents that were once exclusive through systems like Talent Rows, Legendaries, and Covenants can now be equipped at the same time. We've determined that damage done to tanks needs to be increased. While we're thrilled that players are enjoying playing tanks in Dragonflight and we want the role to be healthy, there are some negative effects that can come from tanks being too strong that we want to avoid. We want healers to play a key role in keeping tanks alive, and tanks shouldn't be able to easily solo large portions of encounters after the rest of their group have died. We're adjusting the damage reduction passives on all the tanks, effectively increasing damage tanks take by 10%. We think tanks will still feel powerful after this change, and it will result in a more balanced gameplay for all players. So let's talk about this change in general, and then we will go through how it affects each of the tanks a little bit, because there's some slight differences for the different tanks here, but for the most part, it is indeed a blanket change to all tanks. My gut feeling on reading this is like, oh no, tanking is it's fun when you can live stuff. It's fun when, as the tank, you are the person who's in charge of whether you live or die. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say, okay, healers should be somewhat necessary to keep a tank alive, and tanks shouldn't be able to easily solo large portions of encounters. I do think, like, some of the most fun I've had in World of Warcraft has been soloing or solo tanking encounters long after I was supposed to be able to. I'll remember our progression kill of Raden, for instance. I was able to solo tank the last, 2 minutes of that fight after our other tank died and we didn't have a battle res, and that was a really rewarding experience. But part of the reason it was rewarding was that it wasn't easy. It's definitely true that, if you look at Blood Death Knight in Season 4 of Shadowlands, soloing every encounter after the rest of your group died, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it was it was the kind of thing where it's okay, that's what the DKs are doing, right? That's what DKs do this season. And I do understand them wanting tanks to not look like that. I do think it's important that, tanks should still feel powerful. I think tanks should feel more powerful than they did during Shadowlands, with the exception of Blood Death Knight in Season 4. And I hope that is still the case. I hope that, of course, their testing is their testing on their private, plus 15, plus 20 key servers that I think they are running those. I hope they're not looking at M0s or anything like that. And I've seen people saying that's what they're doing, but I don't know. There's been a lot of back end changes to raid damage values and stuff. I think that their team, their testing and tuning team is not doing they're not doing these based off of what's happening on live right now. They are doing it on the basis of the content that is coming on the 13th and 14th. But yeah. That being said, I do think tanks should be powerful, they should be fun, they should be more powerful than they were for most of Shadowlands, and if they're not, it is both not fun to play tanks and hard to find tanks to play with. So, Blood Fortification no longer has a damage reduction. It used to have a 10%. Demonic Wards, 10% from 20% DR. Ursine Adept, no damage reduction, was 10%. Brewmaster Balance, no damage reduction, was 10%. Aegis of Light, no damage reduction, was 10%. Prot Warrior, a little bit different. Vanguard only had a 5% DR, so they couldn't remove 10% damage from it. They could have given it 5% increased damage taken instead, which would have been a kind of weird passive to have on a tank. That would have been, I guess, the kind of symmetrical way of doing it. But instead, they took 5% off Vanguard, and they took 5% off of defensive stance, and only in PvE. In PvP, it's still a more nerfed version. This is an interesting effect that it means that this nerf on the face of it affects Prot Warriors less than the other tanks in cases where Prot Warriors are able to stand in Battle Stance. It also means that relative to Battle Stance, Defensive Stance got a nerf, so Battle Stance will be something that you may want to stand in more often. That being said, the content where damage reduction and incoming damage mattered the most, you would be in Defensive Stance anyways, and you would still, so I hesitate to say that this is something that's it's way less impactful for Prot Warrior. It's slightly less bad for Prot Warrior than it is for the other tanks, but it's not they nerfed Prot Warrior half as much as they nerfed the other tank. No, they nerfed Prot Warrior most the same that they did the other tanks. Obviously, there's a reasonable argument to be made that they should have nerfed Prot Warrior way more than the other tanks potentially, which we'll see just how well that bears out over the next couple of weeks, or if I'm wrong about that. We also have some changes targeted at reducing the passive healing provided to several DPS specs. Some can be a perk for some specs. We think they are providing too much benefit, particularly compared to more active options. Now here's another one that's actually a big tank nerf. The Hunt now heals for 10% for Havoc, 20% for Vengeance over 20 seconds, instead of 25% or 50% over 30 seconds. So this is a nerf of tremendous proportions, right? It's a 33% nerf in the duration and a 60% nerf in the value of the Vengeance healing from the Hunt. That is a massive nerf to Vengeance's, like, one of Vengeance's effectively defensive cooldowns that they had, one of their self-sustained cooldowns that they could get. So that is actually a big relative nerf to Vengeance compared to the other tanks. Charred Warglaive's not a huge deal nerf there on that. Fodder to the Flame can no longer crit heal. And Havoc has gotten another damage nerf here. Essence Break damage reduced by 8%. That's the third week in a row that Havoc's getting nerfed. And maybe it's sort of close now to the other DPS specs, so that's probably good. They've nerfed Shadow passive self-healing. Still going to be a spec that does a lot of self-healing, but it'll do less. They've nerfed Rogue's Leeching Poison leech bonus, which is actually probably nice, because if you're a Rogue now, you don't have to take that damage loss to run that. Sin Rogue, Poison Bomb is getting a damage nerf here for Sin Rogue after the big Exsanguinate nerf. Still looking to be a rather good damage spec for a raid, though. Outlaw, a slight buff to Dispatch, nerf to Pistol Shot that I think will be a nerf overall in damage for most builds. I'm not 100% sure, though. Subtlety, a nerf to Black Powder, so a nerf to sub AoE. I'm not sure this was necessary at all. I don't think a sub was doing too much AoE damage. And then a bug that caused Secret Technique to interact incorrectly with Cold Blood. I don't know if this is a buffer nerf. I don't know how that worked, so go check with your local sub-theory crafters and Rogue Discord and stuff to know what exactly they mean by this. Warlock is getting some fairly fake nerfs here. The Soul Leech Maximum Shield and Demon Skin Maximum Shield that it granted you of Soul Leech. It was not a huge part of the Soul Leech value. Most of the Soul Leech value was the healing, and if you were rarely hitting the actual overshield cap on this thing anyways. And, well, when you were, it was not important, was my understanding of how that looked from testing. And also a nerf here to the Fell Synergy. So I still think Warlock, I don't think this is nearly as big as a nerf to the last Soul Leech nerf they got last week. Still a very strong tanky class. Fury Warrior is also getting a nerf to Cold Steel Hot Blood healing, and then compensating buffs to make up for the damage side of things there. So their damage is staying unchanged, but their healing is getting nerfed. Also a bunch of PvP changes here. We don't read those on this channel, but, you know, I'm happy for them or whatever, so cool. That is the set of changes that are coming on the weekly reset. The TLDR here is tanking is going to be a little bit tougher than it otherwise would have been. Still, I think tanking is still going to feel better than it did for most Shadowlands, especially better than it did early Shadowlands. In terms of relative tank balance, some people have been saying that Brew is really hurt by this because they were already the worst defensively. I don't actually think that's necessarily true. I think Brew's... When you reduce damage reductions of all tanks, you move the universe closer to one where effective health is actually relevant for all tanks. And as we move to that world, especially against incoming physical damage, Brewmaster actually starts to like that because they perform really well on that metric. So this may be good for them under certain circumstances where there were especially like heavy tank busters that were physical. There's only a little bit of that in the raid, but against that, I think Brew probably lost a little bit less ground than the other tanks did there. But yeah, in general, I think Brew and M+ is probably hurt quite a bit by this. The other tanks, I mean, it is a pretty symmetrical nerf, though, to all tanks. I would say I would hesitate to find winners and losers too much in this set of changes for the tanks. There's a loser here in Vengeance on this Hunt nerf. I think they've definitely lost a little bit of relative standing. These DPS spec changes as well, I don't think are going to move things around too much. They seem to be pretty fair nerfs to specs that will still be providing a lot of self-healing to themselves. Anyways, hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.